Let me shortly introduce, this is Phil Rubinstein, comes from our campaign in the United States. A veteran to the extreme of the fight together with Lyndon LaRouche. And we're extremely happy to have him over here and have him speaking on, what should we say, well, scientific principle and ideas of Lyndon LaRouche.
Some of the ideas, yeah. And, you know, and then also maybe tomorrow we'll have a chance to discuss a little more of what came up in Laney's presentation of Douglas MacArthur in terms of what this idea of the American system, the American Revolution meant and means, and what it is somewhat today for the immediate political situation. In fact, I want to check one thing. Yeah, I think I know what it is. So, the topic is one that, should I speak slow? I'm sorry, I don't know Danish, even though I've been married to a Dane for 27 years. But all those years were in the United States, so. We're going to discuss, in some sense, Lyndon LaRouche's method, maybe with some particular focus on what he has to say about scientific method. But I want to immediately develop some ironies around that, so people don't think of this as science in the normal category. In fact, what we want to create in part is a revolution as much in science as in anything else. Even though a lot of people today think, well, you know, we have a cultural problem, we have a political problem, we have social problems, but science, we sort of do all right in science, you know. And one way to look at this is, even though LaRouche, first of all in the area of economics, in part just because of his circumstances, has applied a certain method which has allowed him to forecast many of the developments of the last, almost 60 years. And maybe I'll refer a little bit to that. Particularly in the area of, you might say, economics and related strategic matters. Again, I have to maybe just reference a few of these things. But at the same time, LaRouche makes it very, very clear that one of the unique perspectives that he has, and that has been lost in science, is that classical forms of artistic composition, I won't try to, not classical culture, because people think of classical culture, often they think of, well, old. You know, Rome was classical, Greece was classical,
Elvis Presley is classical.
In my family, because my parents were a slightly older generation, Frank Sinatra was classical. Maybe now in this new generation it's Elvis Presley. In fact, I had a funny experience with Elvis Presley in Denmark about a week ago. But they had a classical concert in a little town in Denmark, and the guy was an Elvis Presley imitator. So this is for real. Anyway, classical composition, I'm referring to a certain standard, not so much a tradition, because it really wasn't all that traditional. It developed, but it was a classical standard of composition, which in particular came out of the Renaissance in the mid-15th century in Europe, which was a reflection back on the Greek Renaissance, but also a certain advance over the Greek Renaissance. a certain quality of improvement in the Greek, in the conception of the individual, which stands in the middle of all this. Because really, the question that LaRouche addresses in the 21st century is that we have very much lost the conception of what the human mind is. Now, from LaRouche's standpoint, from what he's done as a matter of forecasting, and he makes the point that the ability to have an insight into the future, which really is the core of scientific development. The interesting thing about science, let me put it in the following way. Most people think of a scientific method from a kind of upside-down standpoint. They think, well, what's good about science? In science, you take experience, some kind of measurement or experiment that you have, usually centered in sensory experience, something we observe. And we observe it over and over and over again, and we then form a generalization. This is called induction. For those of you who have been through these things, I don't know how, if you've been in any kind of philosophy introductory course, or even in science courses, they'll often give you a kind of thumbnail sketch. And they'll say, well, this is the way you do science. You have a series of experiences, and you then form the habit. It's not really the knowledge of causality. You form the habit of saying A caused B. The classic example, this is the billiard balls. I don't know, that probably is understandable, the little balls on the table. And you say, well, I saw the billiard ball hit the other ball. I saw this over and over again, and I formed certain generalizations. And these we call universal laws. And then once we have the universal laws, we're able to deduce pretty much mathematically, by some simple mathematics, sometimes complicated mathematical rules, we're able to deduce the consequences of certain actions. So it's all based on simple experience, a kind of method of compilation of data, and actually, for the most part, these things become statistical. It's a higher probability. It's a higher probability of this kind of activity, a higher probability of that kind of activity. Where, in fact, this is not where science comes from. Because, in general, any great scientific discovery is something that does not conform to previous knowledge. It doesn't conform to experience. In fact, it's usually some problem in our experience that leads one to decide there's some principle that we don't know. And what does the discoverer in science have to do? This is, number one, he has to have a sense that this is a serious problem. That somehow our relationship to the future will not succeed, or some problem will occur because we're making a mistake. Our principles are inadequate to the situation. And therefore, I have to decide to look in some direction to construct an idea that solves the problem. That actually represents the discovery of some new principle that's going to change our relationship to the universe. Now, ironically enough, as LaRouche has pointed out, the best example of this kind of classical imagination, an ability to compose something that's a coherent truth about the universe, is most clearly expressed in classical composition, in particular in the area of music. And there's many things to be said about this. Classical drama, poetry. That indeed, what the great composer does is develops a composition, a playing out of a great idea, of an idea that is foreign to the audience, or that is a shock to the audience. is something that the audience doesn't really initially accept, but is drawn into the development of the idea. Let's say in a drama is a good example, or a great poem. I'll try to give some examples. Or music, and then you have great examples of this. You know, Bach's compositions, where you have, for example, an entire idea of a new musical system, which is really expressed not only in all of Bach's work, but is expressed, for example, in the Well-Tempered Clavier, which is 48 pieces, 24 preludes and fugues in Book 1, 20. What does he do? He actually takes some of the work, and I'll reference this, some of the work that was done by Kepler, which is probably one of the best examples of a great scientific discovery. He takes the work that Kepler did on a certain harmony in the solar system, as it was known at the time. This is roughly the end of the 16th century, the early 17th century. And we have a very good example of something that I'm not presenting this as ancient knowledge. I'll make a point that this is the same thing is what LaRouche is criticizing in trying to create a scientific revolution today that we need. And if we don't make this scientific revolution, we will probably face the same kind of crisis that we would face culturally, or we could face in terms of World War III. That is, we will fail as a species to carry out certain things that we need to carry out in order for this species to survive. In fact, to put it in the strongest way, nuclear war can make us extinct. There's no doubt that thermonuclear war, at the scale we're capable of carrying it out today, could destroy the entire human species. It was known as soon as the first bombs were dropped, atomic bombs, at the end of World War II, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that immediately many strategic thinkers, including MacArthur, including Eisenhower, including Einstein, many of the scientists who worked on the bomb, recognized that what had been unleashed, if it was allowed to become part of the normal military arsenal and part of a general war, and indeed, if the weapons existed, they would become part of a general war. That if this occurred, then the human species would not survive. This was stated in 1946, 47, and so forth and so on. And indeed, of course, we know some of the horrors of the wars during the Cold War was that they were carried out under a nuclear umbrella. So you had hideous, limited warfare, which is really imperial warfare. Because the threat was always, it would go to nuclear war. And that threat hovered over people and controlled them. However, of course, there's no guarantee that at an existential point, this could go to nuclear war. And that would be an extinction event. Now that's pretty spectacular, but indeed, if we fail to make certain scientific developments that are adequate to continuing the existence of the species as a whole, we won't survive anyway. Anybody who thinks, it is true that the British, Prince Philip, the Queen of England, also some people like, this is known, for example, in the United States, you have people like Paul Ehrlich, who wrote the population bomb, I think in the late 60s or early 70s. The Club of Rome and the limits to growth. These things have been repeated in the recent years. Schellnhuber, who's the head of an environmentalist group in Germany, also a commander of the British Empire. He was knighted or somehow by the Queen or something. What's their view? Their view is that the human population should be reduced, as Tom mentioned this morning, from 7 billion, well, they become more radical. Actually, Ehrlich, who was a moderate American, I guess, maybe he was just early, he said 7 billion to 2 billion. He was willing to leave 2 billion people on the planet. Recently, Prince Philip and the Queen have said 1 billion. Okay? Schellnhuber, 500 million. And there are others of this stripe that are prepared to unleash. And of course, here's the point. Let me make it very clear. Look, if you tried to implement this kind of devastation on the planet, you wouldn't get to the point of 1 billion. First of all, you'd be destroying the whole species. But frankly, the world would explode in all kinds of ways before this kind of approach succeeded. Eventually, you would have complete social chaos. Call it revolution, call it war, call it just chaos. We already have it. As Tom went through this morning, I won't repeat, we already have it. We have wars all over the place. Just to make a point, no one's yet resolved the problem in Central Africa, where over the last 15 or 20 years, 3.5 million people were killed as a consequence of the war in the Congo and so on and so forth. So we're talking about a scientific development. But LaRouche's point is the only way you get the mental capability of making this kind of change is by the kind of thinking, the kind of quality of creative mind that goes into great composition. In a sense, what are you doing in a great classical composition? You're creating a set of ideas which leads you and forces you to some new idea that resolves whatever problems come up within the existing approach. It's, in a sense, a concentrated version of what happens over a longer period of time in scientific discovery. So you really need classical culture, classical composition to create in the population, and certainly in certain layers in the population, the kind of mentality that leads to creative breakthroughs. That leads, and you know, we won't have time to cover everything, but a good example of this is if you, and I'll come back in some ways to these individuals. A good example of this is if you take the culture that produced Einstein, Planck, before them Riemann, some of the great scientists of the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, even lesser known people like Ehrenfeld and so on and so forth. These characters, or Köhler in the area of physics and psychology, were imbued in classical culture. This was part of the way they existed. For example, Planck had to make the choice, and Planck is the discoverer of the quantum, which of course goes to the core of where, in a certain sense, science left off. But Planck chose between being a concert pianist and a physicist. At a certain point, he decided he wasn't quite good enough as a concert pianist, but he was close. And he chose to continue the work in physics. Einstein, a little more well-known, was a proficient, let's say, high-level amateur violinist. And this is something he always went back to. And if you read some of what they had to say, you'll find that the example that they give, and this is true, I'm not going to be, if you look at in a simple case, Planck has a collection of essays called Where is Science Going? They're not that long, really. It's not and in it, he repeats over and over again that at the point of actual scientific discovery, the only way you can describe it is in terms of a creative intuition, as being like musical composition. These are the terms that he has to use to express it. Einstein says the same thing. And this actually has a whole, for example, you can give many examples, and I think the counter-examples show you what the problem is. For example, many of the scientists today, just to be a little, what do they call it, ad hominem, but you have a guy like William Herschel, who was a great astronomer at the turn of the 18th into the 19th century, right about 1780, 1790, 1800. His son was also a prominent figure. He actually originated, I think, in Saxony, maybe even, and then moved to England. But at the end of the 18th and early 19th century, he was the most prominent astronomer of the time, for good reason, not just in terms of being well known. I'll in a minute mention what he did. But at any rate, he was a musical composer. He composed symphonies at the end of the 18th century for oboe, for other instrumentations, and so on. And his family was like this. And the whole family became part of the astronomers of the time. So this is a tradition that goes on and on. It's not really a tradition. This is what is necessary in order to have the kinds of creativity we need. So in order to have science, which requires a certain kind of social concentration over time, whereas, not that it doesn't require concentration, but in classical composition, even though there is a dialogue socially, there's a concentrated effort at composition, at the creation of something new that is really uniquely capable of being handled within a finite and expressible amount of time. In other words, you can sit down and watch a drama for a couple of hours, or even if it's extended a little bit longer. You can listen to a musical composition over hours, and so on and so forth. When it comes to scientific discovery, it's the same quality of mind over an extended period of time. Now, probably one of the best, and this is what, so LaRouche makes the point that most of his capability, this ability to have a certain insight into where things are going, which, by the way, he makes the point, is not unique to him or to, let's say, others who have had similar kinds of insights. You know, you could say that Ben Franklin had an insight into where history was going. You can say somebody like Schiller understood where history was going. One example, probably less well known, is if you ever read Heinrich Heine on Religion and Philosophy in Germany. This is written in about 1850. And he basically describes the kinds of problems in German culture, despite the high points of the developments of German culture, that were leading in the wrong direction. One of the things that he criticizes is the Nordic mythology. So I don't know if it has any effect here, but the worship of trees and whatever. Anyway, so maybe we have part of it in the green cult. You know, you can say that the original environmentalists were some of these people who worshiped the gods of the forest and so on and so forth. But the essence of this is the ability to generate an insight into the future. This is the nature of the human mind. You can say, for example, as Lynn says in a couple of recent documents, that there are two things that characterize human creative capabilities, the human mind. One is science, the development over time of increasing human power over nature. That there's more and more that we know, and therefore more and more that we can act on, control, or the dangers to be avoided in some cases. And secondly, insight into the future. The ability to use this scientific capability and creative capability to see what we need in the future. And of course, to act on it now. But it is an ability to walk, as he says in a recent document, in the future. You begin to realize somebody like Franklin, or somebody like Schiller, or Leibniz. These are the kind of people whose minds, whose existence is in the future. They literally exist now for what they are going to contribute to the human species in the future. Now, one good example that brings some of this together in a very interesting way. And Lynn refers to this a lot recently, are the three figures of Cusa, the Cardinal Cusa of the 15th century, probably the least known of the figures. Johannes Kepler, who's 1570 to 1630 roughly, and Shakespeare, who also is roughly the same time period, maybe a little younger. I think it's 1561 to 1551 or 61 to 1616. So he lives a little bit before Kepler. And it's an interesting point to raise because take the case of Kepler, and I take that briefly to begin with because of a certain reference to what we have today. Because essentially what LaRouche is calling for is a scientific revolution that really, contrary to what people think about their iPads and their computers and Twitter and tweet and so on and so forth, and this is in a funny way creating a universal habits, but they're not all that good. One of the things I saw in a recent weekend was we were visiting some relatives of Laney, and there were children, 10 and 6, and bright kids, but and sweet kids, but not totally dominated by this instant intellectual culture, if you want to call it that, or not intellectual. They had, at 6 years old, they're given iPads for free in school. Now, on the one hand, you can say at least that's a nice attention to pay to the children's development. On the other hand, it creates children who seem to be very bright because they seem to have access to everything, but they have no attention span. They have the attention span, I don't know if this translates, of a cricket. Every second they're jumping. They're going somewhere. They've got something else has to attract their attention. I mean, you see this all the time with people. One thing, there's no way to stop it. And I don't know if, you sit in a room, and inevitably, particularly if there's younger people, but a lot of older people have gotten the habit. People play with their phone. They're looking at their email. They're writing a quick text. They're checking something out. They want to see what's the latest here or there. And they have no attention for whatever else is going on. And the same thing is true in classes and so on and so forth. So, we're talking about an actual revolution in science. Let me give you one kind of example. If we're going to do what we have to do, this really doesn't even quite touch a revolution. But if we're going to do what we have to do, we have to solve some of the problems that remain in nuclear physics, if we want to give it a name. But what do I mean? We need to develop not just full 4th and 5th generation fission power. Now, this is, of course, a big issue, probably more in Europe even than the United States. Nuclear fission, safe power. Lots of power, safe, and extremely dense, which I'll come to in a few minutes. Energy flux density. In order to improve our ability to produce things, you have to always improve the density of the power that you have. And that's been the history of the human species. That is, in a sense, one of the great clues to the nature of the human species. Energy flux density. So what do we need? We need fusion power, which is a couple of order of magnitudes greater than nuclear fission, which means our ability to produce things massively increases. For example, it does a lot to change our idea of raw materials, because fusion gives you a density of power that allows you to create materials. You can take, relatively speaking, diluted resources and separate them out rapidly, which means that that your backyard might be the equivalent of a nice mine of some kind or other, because you'll be able to get out of it a great deal of otherwise trace minerals in the soils. And there are many other things that you can do. We can we can change our relationship to the solar system. and we can begin to think of ourselves outside of the planet Earth. Because we can ship things more rapidly with fusion propulsion. These things have been planned. They've been on the books for 50 years. Now, clearly, there's two problems here. One is there's certain problems that need to be solved. Although in the case of fusion, it's closer to being engineering problems. The other, of course, is the political will to do it. The political desire, the sense of purpose to do this kind of thing. Because once you have the density of fusion power, you can begin to deal with issues of matter, antimatter, which do exist. In fact, we just discovered in the recent years places where antimatter exists that we didn't know existed before. We can begin to come to a greater understanding. For example, antimatter exists in the thunderclouds in dense thunderstorms over the planet Earth. This was not known until the recent period. Okay? In general, antimatter was considered to be something that we only experienced under rare circumstances from supernova and so on and so forth. But there's more of it. It's not much, but it's a beginning. But we have to know a lot more about the way the universe works.
Maybe you can just define what antimatter
It's,
is.
basically, it's a complicated question. But in the course of some of the discoveries coming off of the early part of the 20th century, it was discovered that there was, for an electron, for example, there was what they called a positron. A mirror image with a positive charge. That is something of the same mass, the same structure, but instead of having a negative charge, it had a positive charge. For the proton, there was the equivalent of an antiproton. Now, there's a very funny question that comes. I don't want to go off into too many sidetracks, but they're much more in the way of genuine mysteries that are themselves, in a way, awe-inspiring in the universe that most people think about these days. They either think, well, we can't think about these things, or somehow they think we've all that we could know, we know. We have a complete system. Okay, so what happened is, what the interesting problem is, if you take the standard Big Bang theory, which of course is lunacy to a certain extent. Well, it is not to a certain extent. It's the idea, well, the universe all began. You sort of unwind the film backwards, and you've got basically a statistical gas theory of the universe. That's all it is. And they have other complicated aspects of it, but it amounts to a statistical gas theory. In other words, you've got these little particles, each independently bouncing around, and the only force in the world is gravity. After the beginning, there's other, there's the strong forces and the weak forces. So you get this explosion, and everything is sort of a big plasma gas. And after a while, the only relevant force is gravitational forces. So these things now, in a complicated way, begin to spread out, and they should spread out completely evenly, because it's equivalent forces in all directions to begin with, and then gravitational forces and so on. So the idea is that's the way the universe works. And somehow there's a crinkle in the universe and a galaxy forms. There's an accidental crinkle somewhere else. Where these crinkles come from, I have no idea. They have all kinds. It's very much like what Kepler had to deal with. So because different little mechanisms are thrown in to solve the problem. Interesting enough, do you have a question?
Yeah, just about that. It wasn't the original paper proposing the Big Bang, the alpha, beta, gamma folks. Wasn't that basically just an idea to say, look, creation is not an ongoing process. It's just one fart, yeah, and then a fizzle. Yeah, I mean, it's the second law of thermodynamics. I'll make a reference to that. The universe is dead. All these things come up to the same thing, and it's all really the end of the 19th and the 20th century. This is what you can say to define this as a dark age, because that was the end of a real sense of the human mind, of human discovery, of human creativity. This is what we've lived through in the 20th century, with the exception of a few
you could say, last members of a dying breed. People like Planck and Einstein and Curler and a few other followers, many of whom got lost in the shuffle. So one of the interesting things about this theory is, once you find out that there's supposed to be, for every electron, a positron, for every proton, an antiproton, and there's evidence that these things exist. The question is, if the universe started out everything equal, the real question isn't why is there so little antimatter, because there's very little that's available in the universe as we know it. The question is, why is there so much matter? Why was there a surplus of what we call matter? Because in the course of things, when matter and antimatter come together, they annihilate each other. So if you had equal amounts of matter and antimatter in the origin of the universe should have annihilated itself. There should be nothing left. So why is there anything left? That's the big question. How come this imbalance? Why are we here, according to this theory? Now, at present, since there are small amounts of antimatter, and antimatter can be produced under certain conditions. We actually are already doing this in some laboratory experiments, in very small amounts. In fact, we spoke to a guy in, I think, San Diego who does one of the leading experiments from this business. Now, if you could then take matter and antimatter and produce a certain amount of antimatter under controlled conditions, you would have a source of energy, just to call it energy, which is orders of magnitude beyond fusion power. You would be in an entirely different world. And who knows what other things would come across. Look at all the medical offshoots of developments in nuclear research at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. You have to realize a great deal of what is considered now the additional medical capabilities that we have are products of our knowledge of isotopes and the fact that certain variants of carbon, certain variants of other minerals can be used to trace processes in the human body, which we would otherwise never be able to deal with. So we need a total revolution in science which gets us away from this jerry-rigged, really mathematical system. And mathematics is dead. You know, you don't need, mathematics is pure deduction. That is normal. When we talk about conventional mathematical schemes, there are innovations in mathematics by people who make creative discoveries, usually in working on scientific discoveries, and find they need to develop a new aspect of the language. And mathematics is a very limited language. But if you just take the formalisms of mathematics, they're completely limited. There's nothing in the mathematics, if you're given a mathematical language, that can generate anything new. Now, one of the big things, of course, in science is this idea of completeness. For example, the standard outlook, up until recently, in nuclear physics, quantum theory, is that we've got the whole story. The so-called standard model, we've got it all. It's all finished. Now, a good way to think about this, which means it's the end of thinking, at least in that area of science, and probably all of them, because we say that everything gets reduced to its elementary part. We reduce the human body to its chemical parts and then to its atomic parts. We reduce life to the non-living and the elementary parts of the non-living. And we try to build up living material, the human mind, from non-living, non-thinking parts. We try to deduce it from a set of mathematical equations. And this is really where the whole idea of sense perception goes completely off the wall. Completely insane. That we can encompass the nature of the universe through sense experience, which is not only limited to the individual human being, but even limited to the planet. There are many things which are available to human thinking to the human mind, which may use sense perception as a little bit of a clue to start with. Usually you start out with the problems. There are many things that the only thing we can possibly do to conceive of them is to get away from sense perception. Get away from simple empirical data. And get to the processes of the human mind, which are an indication of the way the universe is really working. That is unseen and unheard. And ironically enough, this is what all great classical composition tries to get you to think about, not what you hear, but what's the idea that's provoked. What's the idea that you have of it? It's not pleasant sounds. Now, a good example of historically how to look at this is take the case of Kepler. Now, Kepler was, in one sense, a supporter of Copernicus. And keep in mind that for 1,500 years or more, people either did believe or were forced to believe that the Earth went around the Sun. I mean, the Sun went around the Earth. And all the planets go around the planet Earth. And we had the Ptolemaic system. Now, I won't go into every detail on this. But this was a pure mathematical system. In other words, first of all, the Earth didn't really go around the Sun. The Earth went around a central point, which was a mathematical point. And what is a mathematical point? Nothing. And the Sun was a little bit off-center. And it just sat there and it didn't move. But all the planets, I mean, I keep saying the Sun, the Earth rather, but all the planets moved around the Earth, which was a little bit off-center. And then, when they had problems that didn't quite work out, they made all kinds of changes in the geometry of the system. Okay, they developed what they called an equant point. This was a point. So now, even though the shape of the orbit is a circle, there was changes in the rate at which the circle moved. But it was always an equal amount of angle from what was called the equant. So the equant's off-center, but the planet moves in such a way that it's always, in the same amount of time, moves the same degree of arc. Okay, or the same angle. Now, this wasn't enough, because you have other phenomena, like what they call retrograde motion. So they added epicycles. So the planet now doesn't really move in this circular orbit. It moves around a point that moves in the circular orbit. So just to give you an idea what it looks like. I'm probably spinning. Yeah. Here's the orbit. And here's the Earth, I guess. Now the planet actually doesn't move on the orbit. The planet is moving on what's called an epicycle. And the epicycle is going around this point. So that's really what the orbit of the planet looks like. And they added as many epicycles as they had to add to make it work out. It was a pure mathematical construct. And the idea was, well, if it worked, if the observations, as they say, the appearances were saved, that was good enough. What Kepler did was Kepler said it's impossible for a mathematical point to be the cause of anything. It doesn't exist. There is no nothing that can have an effect in the universe. In fact, recently LaRouche had this funny thing where he said, zero doesn't really exist. Zero is sort of the reduction of the human individual, or this idea of infinite divisibility. You reduce everything to nothing, and nothing doesn't do anything. There has to be an actual physical cause. So Kepler makes the point without going through all of it. It's a fascinating material to read because Kepler does give you an idea of how he really constructs this. Okay, so Kepler changes the whole view really of the universe. But it's at the time the universe is essentially the solar system. The fixed stars were another question somewhat. They were considered fixed stars. We only learned a lot about this much later. It's also worth noting, for those of you who are a little bit jaded, how little we knew until these kinds of processes we're going through. Anyway, Kepler discovers, first of all, that, well, really what he starts from the whole time, he says, look, there must be some physical causality in the way the solar system works. And the physical causality has to create a set of relations within the entire solar system that gives us an idea of what the lawfulness of the solar system as a whole is. Because the solar system is not fixed. The solar system itself goes through changes, the relationships amongst the orbits, and so on and so forth. There has to be a harmonic ordering of those relationships. And since we exist in an intelligible universe, a universe that he believed was created, that therefore is intelligible to a creative mind, there must be some physical principle that governs the ordering of the solar system. Now, on this basis, what did Kepler discover? Number one, that the orbits are not, first of all, that the sun is the actual motive force of the planets. And you have to look at everything from the standpoint of the sun as sort of the conductor of the solar system. And secondly, that the orbits around which the planets move are not circular. There's a constant process of change. They're elliptical, which means that they have a double periodicity and so on and so forth. Number three, there's a harmonic ordering to the orbits. Now this comes out in what they call the 3/2 law. I always get it a little bit wrong, but the cube of the time, or the cube of the distance and the square of the time of all of the orbits are equal. That is, you take Saturn, you take the cube of the, I think I have it right, the cube of the time and the square of the distance, and you form a fraction. That fraction will turn out to be the same for every orbit in the system. Now actually, later on, he went much further with this, and he described what he began with in his earliest document, that since the universe is one universe, vision, hearing, sound, all these are ordered in the same way. They have some underlying harmonic structure, harmonic ordering principle. And so what Kepler begins to look at is what appear to be the dissonances between the visual measurements and what would be the frequencies of the planet. And he actually works out a musical system. And we have some very good material on the LPAC website. Well, not the website, but yeah, it's on the LPAC website. He begins to develop an actual musical system such that, in effect, the orbits are constantly in a harmonically well-tempered, well-ordered relationship. It's much more complex than people think it is. It's because he's not talking about a fixed system. He's not talking about one tuning system. He's talking about a system that constantly tunes itself, adjusts itself, so that the orbits remain in a harmonic relationship even though the orbits are changing. They're all changing. And this is ordered by the relationship to the sun. And then, of course, even more, there are secondary relationships amongst the planets which create these differences. So it's really Kepler that discovers gravity, not Newton. And in fact, a more profound conception of gravity than anything most people are taught. Because it's not a gravity which is simply a, relatively speaking, occult force that seems to leap at an infinite rate between objects. But it comes closer to what Einstein later talks about. It's a structuring of space-time. It's an ordering principle. And this is so it's not a simple, constant addition and subtraction of mathematical terms. Now, and this doesn't come from any simple observation. It really comes from what LaRouche calls a metaphor. Because metaphors are, this is the essence of irony in classical thinking. Metaphors are not clever descriptions of something that are a little bit different. You know, he walked like a graceful tree, you know, or something. I don't know. And you say, well, that's a metaphor because, you know, that's not a metaphor. That might be a bit interesting image, depending on how big a klutz the guy was. But, you know, it's not a metaphor. A metaphor really is an irony that changes necessarily your whole conception, forces you into some deep change in what you think about the world. So, for example, in the case of Kepler, he did some very interesting things in the new astronomy, where he creates what he calls a vicarious hypothesis. He takes the Ptolemaic hypothesis and so on, and he says, I'm going to generate a new hypothesis with the sun at the center, but basically, schematically, very much like the others. But I'm not going to have any epicycles, and I'm going to demonstrate its mathematical equivalence to the prior systems. So it's a completely different idea. But it rests within the same principles that appear to rest with the other hypotheses. And then he demonstrates that there is a problem. That the problem is with this idea and getting rid of all this mathematical points, you end up with a discrepancy in the orbit of Mars. And the way he does this is he does it by putting himself on Mars. Because the problem is to figure out what the Earth's orbit is. And what he does is he takes two positions in Mars. And, you know, in other words, Mars takes a certain amount of time to complete its orbit. And so he takes that amount of time, and this occurs over a 2-year period. And he takes the positions of the Earth with respect to Mars as it comes back to its original position. So this is not observation, this is not empirical, this is a thought experiment. This is a matter of the imagination, of creativity. It's not unlike what Einstein does later on this question of the constancy of the speed of light. And this, by the way, this is modern astronomy. Now, it's also very interesting, I think, though all these things, but this is part of the point that LaRouche is making. That if you take Kepler was a student of Cusa. The Cusa I'm not going to go into in detail, but Cusa was the father of the Renaissance and the father of modern science. The Doctor Ignorantia, he puts forward a method of this kind of irony, this kind of apparent contradiction coming from a limited understanding of the meaning of certain ideas. And how when you bring them to their full resolution, you're forced to something that goes beyond the original ideas, if you're going to solve the problem. Maybe there isn't a solution, but that's the only way you can go with this. Okay? Much of what Cusa talks about is scientific and at the same time theological. But nonetheless, this is in the area that, for example, Kepler cites Cusa over and over again as the core method that he's using, that it's real science. So now, to put a couple of fine points on it, and this goes to some of what Lynn has been talking about, Bach, who really is the great revolutionary of classical music. So classical music doesn't go back 3,000 years. Classical composition really has its generative point, even though there are people before him that contribute to it, and so on and so forth. Bach creates modern classical music. And because it's not fixed music. If you look at Bach, Bach is effectively taking the advances that he saw being made by somebody like Kepler in understanding the crucial nature of musical harmonies that go outside of the sound, go outside of the notes, that it's an idea that's, you can say, above the sounds. It's a demonstration of an underlying principle of self-developing harmonies. And so Bach turns this into what's called the well-tempered system. Now, a lot of people want to know, what's the tuning of the well-tempered system? There is no single tuning of the well-tempered system. It starts with a conception, and then it uses the fact that no linear conception, equal tempering, which people used and so forth, no linear conception of tempering will give you a musical system that sustains its harmonic ordering through a series of developments into different tonics and different dominants and tonics and so on and so forth. But he wants something that you can use to, so to speak, navigate through the entire universe of music. And to do this, he begins with the concept that Kepler uses in developing the new astronomy and the harmonies and so forth. This is where you get the beginning of modern science. Kepler is the beginning, you could say, Coues is the father of modern science. Kepler is the first modern scientist, despite the slanders, right? I don't know if any of you have ever heard of, but Kepler is viewed as a mystic, a jumble of crazy ideas that somehow worked out, or a defender of his mother who was a witch. She was tried for being a witch and so forth. So, you know, they make up fantastic stories about him. He lived a, shall we say, a difficult life, like many people. And of course, around the same time, you have Shakespeare. And you wouldn't have, you know, I can say for sure, you wouldn't have had any decent science, whatever limited amount you had in England. You probably would never have had the American Revolution without William Shakespeare. You certainly probably wouldn't have had the survival of the United States without Shakespeare. You wouldn't have had the German Weimar culture without Shakespeare. This is true. Shakespeare, you know, Schiller studied Shakespeare. It was Lessing who translated Shakespeare into German. Shakespeare was the favorite source of insight for Abraham Lincoln. When Lincoln had to deal with his cabinet and dealing with the Civil War, he would quote Shakespeare to them. He would quote from Macbeth, from Lear, from the history plays. He didn't know all the plays, but from Hamlet. This was his insight into statecraft, because that's what Shakespeare was doing. Now, what do you have in Shakespeare? You know, you have a concept of history that's completely different than you get anywhere else, except for Schiller and a few other examples. Because he makes it clear that history, the development of the human species, the development of these ideas, are rooted, and he roots them in the dramas in particular, the tragedies, are rooted in the beginning to understand the failures of political leadership to deal with reality, to deal with the actual circumstances facing, in most cases, these obviously are, you know, countries ruled by monarchs and so on and so forth. He takes certain legends, he takes other things. But he says, let me put this on stage and let me confront the audience with the relationship between what's on stage and the reality that is actually faced. And one of the great examples that Lynn gives of this is the chorus in Henry V. Now, that I would invite people to look at. I'm certainly no expert on it. But he does have this chorus structure where the chorus basically says to the audience, what you're about to see is not reality. And you have to figure out, you the audience, have to understand what's the relationship between what you see on the stage and the actual reality that these people faced and wouldn't face. Now, I think also, if you look at Shakespeare, if you look at, it'd be an interesting thing to compare Shakespeare's sonnets to the preludes and fugues in Bach? And what's the actual nature of these sonnets? Because usually they're portrayed as, you know, at first he's talking about pretty young women, and then he's talking about growing old, and then he's talking about having children, and then he, you know, and so on and so forth. There's a certain sequence to it. But what is actually being developed? It's 150 some odd sonnets. What's his actual conception of how this is getting across an idea about humanity, about the nature of the human mind, of human development? And these things together begin to give you an idea of what are the roots of a certain kind of revolution in thinking, which we had little bits and pieces of. And now, if we don't have that revolution, we're we're in deep trouble. Now, let me come back to Lynn's view of science and the mind, because that's really what we're talking about. The essence of this is a point that has been made over and over again, that LaRouche has made in the most rigorous way. And in some ways, I would make the following point about Lynn. There's a lot of things within which you can point to predecessors. Great minds, great people. I'm not diminishing them. Okay? But there's a certain sense in which Lynn, in part because of where he stands in history, because of, as they say, the shoulders that he stood on, in part because of the nature of the crisis that we face, and in part because his own commitment to these ideas, that he brings these things together in a certain rigorous form that has not really been done, at least to my knowledge, until now. Now, I would say sometimes if you look back to Plato, if you take out the fact that we're talking about almost 2,500 years ago, given what was known, he comes close to a similar kind of view. Cusa clearly does, and Leibniz, there are others. But, for example, on this rigorous identification of the artistic imagination and the development of scientific creativity, for example, or the fact that this is politics. Politics is culture, politics is science. The human species is nothing but progress. Now, this is a very difficult idea to get across now, because I purposely say difficult, not to excuse myself, but just to have a sharp idea of what we have to get at. Because look, I know from the United States, progress, I'll give you a funny version of it, I have to, in the 1950s, there was a company called General Electric, which still exists. It's one of the big corporations. They're now heavily into finances and so on and so forth. They still have a industrial side. At any rate, their slogan during the 1950s was General Electric, progress is our most important product. Now, there was a time when the word progress had some meaning to it. The human species progresses. It develops. Or at least it should develop. That progress is a good thing, because progress usually referred to technological, scientific development, improvements in sanitary conditions, improvements in living standards, and so on and so forth. Now what do people say? Progress? What are you, crazy? Progress is bad. How do you know it was progress? I mean, we have all these people. Yes, we have better living standards, but we have all these problems. Pollution. We're threatened. It's not really progress. There's no such thing as progress. That's a value consideration. You can't impose value into the universe. So when you say progress, it falls flat, or there's hostility towards it. Now, the truth of the matter is, as far as that unless the human species progresses, it dies. And I mean, by progress, I mean explicitly what we talked about. I mean, the increasing, first of all, the real measure of it. You can use a certain measure of it. The increasing energy flux density. The increasing rate of scientific development. Energy flux density is concrete. I'll come back to the simplest example of it. examples of it. But it means the ability to move a certain amount of activity, a certain amount of work through an ever-shrinking area and through at an increasing rate per capita, per individual. And I want to spell that out in a very particular way. I want to introduce something that I think takes off from what Lynn, because I also think you need an increasing density of people per person, not just per square kilometer, but an increasing number of people per person. And that's why you need a growing population. Because if you need progress, you need to create a circumstance under which there's increasing productivity and increasing creativity in the population. More and more of the children develop increasing creative powers. Now that means that you have to support these individuals. They're going to need education. They're going to need health care. You can't be producing children who go to develop till the age of 20 or 25 and they die at the age of 40 or 50. They're going to have to live to be 80, 90, and you're going to find the longer they live, the more they can produce. Because it's the mind, not their physical capability. And in particular, as we realize we need to gain control over at least the inner solar system. We need to know more about the laws of the solar system. We need to have a deeper understanding of what life is and is not. Where does life occur? We've been shocked by this. Even on the planet Earth, we found places that have life only in the last 20 years. We didn't know, for example, that life existed in thermal vents that spewed out sulfuric acid at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. But there is life there. And I'm not just talking about bacteria, although there is bacteria. There's also small shell-like creatures, things that look a little bit like shrimp, and so on and so forth. We didn't know that creatures existed many feet under the Antarctic and Arctic ice caps, in tunnels of ice. We didn't know how vigorous life was until the last couple of decades. We don't know what it's going to look like elsewhere. And therefore, we don't really understand our own biological substrate. Because you have to begin to look at the development of life on Earth from the standpoint of the way in which life has and has not developed under different chemical conditions, under different circumstances. There's a great deal that we don't know yet about these things. Now, what are we? So, if you're going to develop that kind of capability, you need more and more people per person. Because the protection, the development, the education, the level of experience, the level of health care per individual increases. Now, so therefore, if you look at the planet today, for example, if you wanted to bring the planet up to, let's say, a modest living standard, let's say in Europe or Denmark or whatever, maybe Denmark is a little bit too high, I don't know, but Europe. You would now consider bringing the African continent up to this, bringing Asia up to this. What does that take in terms of what we're capable of producing per person? And what kind of support would we have to give to each of these people? And this would actually solve our problems the only way that we can. Because the other way to solve the problem is to kill the human species. And anybody who thinks you can do it in some kind of controlled way, oh, okay, we got too many people, we're going to kill off a few billion, we're not as bad as the Queen. Just 2 or 3 billion. Is this going to cause war? Is this going to cause disease? Is this going to cause... Where do you control this?
And who should be killed?
And who should be killed? All right? So, how do you develop this? Now, if you look at what the point that Lynn has made for many years, even though with Lynn, he's developed ideas over 40 or 50 years. They've changed. You can't say, well, I read Lynn 30 years ago, and he said this, and blah, 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 because a lot of it has changed. He's developed because he's been pushing these ideas at their frontier. And in fact, that's how he insists that we work politically and intellectually. You have to go to the frontier, the science drivers. And you start from the science driver and you work backwards. What's the level of education you need? What's the level of development that you need? What's the level of progress? I'll give you a good example to me of monetarism. I find this a perfectly good pedagogy. I don't know if for example, in the United States, we've had fusion programs for about 50 years. That is peaceful fusion. That go back, actually, at least almost 60 years. At least the Princeton Plasma Lab is in the mid-1950s. Because as soon as we had fusion, we knew that there was a potential energy source. Now, the truth is that it's always been underfunded. You know, the way it's normally played is, well, this is an idea for the future, and it's never really worked. You know, we've been working at it for 50 years, maybe someday it'll work. But the truth is, it was never a crash program like, let's say, the atomic bomb itself. You know how many scientists worked on the Manhattan Project? 2,000 scientists. You know how many people were involved in the Manhattan Project? Close to 200,000. Okay? Now, there's a whole other story that I might get a chance to go into tomorrow, because if you want to know what the source of McCarthyism was, what the generation of McCarthyism wasn't McCarthy, it was Truman. And what was he doing? He was making the scientists sign loyalty oaths, pass security clearances, because idiot Truman thought that the Soviets could never figure out how to build an atomic bomb. And of course, who was behind this? Churchill. Oh, Truman actually said this publicly. I don't think the Soviets are smart enough to build an atomic bomb. What a lunatic. But of course, he had, you know, Churchill and the British pushing this line. And so that's where it started. That was the beginning of, it was really the beginning of what you see with Eric Snowden today. It was the beginning of the surveillance state. It was the foot in the door, starting with a couple thousand scientists. Now, what's the point? What's human existence, actually? From the first time we existed as human beings, we used too much resources. We used to say this, and this is a bit of an exaggeration, I suppose, because it was a condition that never existed. But as soon as there was one human being, the planet was overpopulated. Because what's the nature of a human being? Now, if you had one human being acting like a chimpanzee or a baboon, that may not have overpopulated the world, but it probably wouldn't have survived. Human beings, how do we exist? We're different completely than animals. And I want to underline that point because I think it often gets passed over. And Lynn has made, because it's not just that we're an animal that has a funny central nervous system. We're not a complicated animal. We're not a sophisticated animal. We're not animals at all. We're different than animals, and I could use the word ontologically. That is the nature of our being, the way we exist. The substance of our existence is different than an animal. Animals are not creative. They may be interesting, and there's certainly differentiations amongst animals. But no animal, the idea that a chimpanzee using a rock to open up a nut for 1,000,000 years is like what human beings have done is completely off the charts. And I've seen this stuff. You know, the fact, probably one of the best examples that Lynn has given, which does define it, is no animal would touch fire unless it gets burned up. Human beings, for a long time, have used the efforts to control, to subdue, to use fire at increasing densities. Think of that as a kind of metaphor. Because what do we have? We have fire, we have wood, we have then coal, what do they call, fossil fuels, petrochemicals. Okay? Each one is increasingly dense, gives you an increasing ability to do work. Then you enter nuclear, thermonuclear, and who knows what beyond. That's how the human species exists. And it's true. For example, the association of what we, something that's like a human being with fire probably goes back minimally 500,000 years. Maybe as much as 2 million years. But not beyond that. At a certain point, you begin to get the ability to control fire, to create food, and to create tools. So, for example, probably some of the earliest examples of fire was cooking. And this may go back as much as 1.5 million or 2 million years. It's a little unclear. But if it does, it's probably cooking. And what does cooking do? It changes the chemical structure of the food so that it's digestible. Now, that isn't the cause of what happened. What caused it was the signs of creative mind. The creative abilities of the human species are unique. Now, as little as probably 100 or 200,000 years ago, we began to use fire, and we have evidence of this, to shape tools. So, for example, instead of stone tools, which you could use to cut things, you began to take the stone and use fire to use it much more like an ore, particularly if they were rich in ore. So you can now produce effectively metal knives, or the beginning of metal cutting equipment, spears, and so on and so forth. And of course it does a whole array of other things in terms of social relations and so on and so forth. Now the human species exists by the constant development of its scientific and therefore technological capabilities. But the real point is, it exists by producing the conditions under which human beings can exercise more and more of their creative capabilities, can think further into the future, can do more, can use science to begin to see, and the development of the mind, where the human species needs to go. What ultimately is our mission in the universe? Now, if you begin to realize this, you begin to realize that the human species has a quality to it that no other animal has in a different way. And in some ways, you could say, it begins to give the individual a more profound insight. That is, that the human individual has a quality of immortality that no animal has. You know, you can talk about animals spreading their DNA and so on and so forth, their genes, fine. But the animal has there's nothing in the animal that is either aware of or that produces this. It's a purely biological phenomenon. Human beings produce creative developments, or they at least assimilate creative capabilities. That is, the ideas of other human beings to be passed on to further generations. In that sense, the human personality, the human individual, creates its own legacy, creates its own contribution to the future. You don't need to live forever. In fact, most of us don't. And I would say you really have to recognize that while it's, and I'll give you a little, while it's true that we have a certain kind of immortality, don't treat this as a fantasy. Because whatever you're going to do for your immortality, you're going to do within your mortal lifespan. And you create the conditions under which you can, with some degree of confidence, say that there will be future generations. Because I've created the capability, along with other human beings, for those future generations to face their future. Because you don't want to just create a future for future generations. You want to create the potential for future generations to be able to look as far ahead as we do, at least. And that really is politics. You know, the one thing I might quote from later on is, you know, there's a great quote from the U.S. Constitution, because the preamble of the Constitution is for us and our posterity. And I doubt that there's any other constitution that has that as the guiding principle. For us and our posterity. The benefits, not just for ourselves, but as a nation, we're here to guarantee the future existence of future generations. And in a sense, that's the goal of science. That's the you know, the reason for scientific development that characterizes the human species. We are a species that exists solely through our intellectual powers and our human emotional powers. Now, there's more to be said for this, because indeed, there is a sense in which I would take the sense perception question even further. There is a way that the human mind does have a capability of insight, for example, into other human minds, into social processes. In a sense, as Lynn says, we can sort of attune ourselves to the mind of another human being and to the mind of social processes and to where the future is going. And it's not something that you see, feel, hear, touch, or smell. Maybe you can smell it. But it's something that is, you could say it's a different sense, but it's not a sense organ. It's an insight into the human mind. Now, where does this come from? It comes from the human mind. It comes from the development of your own mind, from your knowledge of the development of other human minds. And you have to realize something. I always, to me, to the greenies, or the environmentalists, whatever the word is here, I've seen these people, I saw them when they hit the world as a pestilence of a certain kind. I mean, there's always been environmentalism of some kind or other, but it really didn't become a big deal to the late 60s and early 70s. And I saw what happened. You had a lot of people, students in particular, people of my generation, who became extremely pessimistic. And this was the culmination of the 20th century. You know, you were raised on World War I and World War II, and then came the Vietnam War, and of course the Kennedy assassination, which was not just an event for the United States. People felt that around the world. And it created an enormous pessimism. And so what did you get? Environmentalism became, and the counterculture. Drugs, free sex, anti-classical culture, anti-science, anti-the human mind. The whole idea, what's the human mind? It's nothing. You're aware of the pain of existence. That's what it is to have a mind. You're aware of the absurdity of existence. That all it is a search for pleasure, to get to the end of life. These were not the way people thought all the time. There may have been a lot of bad periods, but there were periods of optimism. There were periods of a sense of development, of potential. There's a lot of things to go that could be brought up. The Roosevelt period, even Kennedy, the space program, the founding of the United States. Other examples of this. The Renaissance itself was a period where people thought there was no limit to what human beings could do, because we have the creative capabilities that have come. Now here's the killer point. Where did we come from? You know, how can you say that what human beings do is artificial and what trees do is natural? First of all, the tree probably wouldn't be there if it wasn't for a human being. Let's face it, the planet is under the construction of human beings, and that's not going to change. If you pulled human beings out now, the planet would die. Or it would turn into an insect haven or something. It would be a breeding ground for destruction. But the fact is, where did we come from? Nature. So we have a right to do what nature told us to do. This is the creative power of nature. Nature has been a constant development itself. Not just human beings, but nature itself. Otherwise, we wouldn't exist. We wouldn't have not just consciousness, but the ability to unfold, to discover the laws of nature. We wouldn't have the ability to generate more power through greater knowledge of what nature is. We're the product of the constant upshift in natural development. And that's what the universe forms galaxies, it forms clusters of galaxies, it develops processes that generate greater growth. Even a supernova probably is one of the sources of various materials in the universe. We're natural. We're not an unnatural. We weren't brought here by Satan. We weren't dumped in by Beelzebub. We're not something that was sent in to destroy the wonderful flowers, plants, and trees of the planet. We may even develop better forms of it. Most of the animals that are surviving today survive because we decided to keep them. Otherwise, they go extinct like animals do. You know, a lot of animals went extinct before we came along. Extinction is a natural process. Why should we get in the way of it? You know, we managed to save a bunch of semi-extinct animals. And we create animals, you know, species of dogs, cattle, who knows what else. That's the nature of what we do. Now, you know, and what you begin to recognize is that an insight into the way the universe really works is the way the human mind works. And you actually start from the top. You start from creative mentation. You look at biology from the standpoint of biological development of a living creature like ourselves. And then you look at inanimate nature, so to speak, as what in the inanimate makes it appropriate to life. How does life incorporate the inanimate and make it, in some sense, alive? Because, you know, many materials, when you incorporate them into the human body or into a living body, act differently inside of life than they act outside of life. There's a radical change. There's all kinds of things that we don't take into account anymore. The human mind is not just the central nervous system. It's not if you reduce it to the brain, to electrochemical circuits and so on and so forth, obviously you need it functioning. But what the mind then does is different than the electrical circuits. No amount of electrical circuits put together become creative. You can do things with computers, you can give it feedback loops, you can give it recursive functions, you can give it all these things, but it'll never become creative. And that's exactly the sense of the human species that we have lost. That we have given up. And it's all pessimism. It's 100 years of pessimism. One of the points, you know, if you look at it, World War I, World War II. Okay, you know, World War II was a different circumstance. It was a war that had to be fought. But it wouldn't have had to have been fought if we had done better about World War I or about the end of the 19th century. Science has essentially stagnated from the end of the 19th, early 20th century. You had the development of the quantum by Planck. You had the development of relativity theory and a lot of work on quanta by Einstein. You had a few other people working in this direction. De Broglie made an effort, Schrodinger. But you had the takeover of this insane positivist, empiricist theory or view of mankind. What does Heisenberg and Born say? You can't know anything. Or Bohr, Niels Bohr. I don't want to hit a national idol here, but you know, Niels Bohr. Yeah, you can't know anything. I just give you a prescription. You can either describe it as a wave or you can describe it as a particle. But once you choose one, that's it. And it's really not about anything that you know. You know, the electron appears here, and it appears there, and it appears nowhere in between. Well, maybe there's some way to look at this. Or it's purely probabilistic, which is particularly Born and Heisenberg are heavy on this. It's a pure mathematical construct. And when Einstein and Planck say, no, we need to know how this actually works, what's the physical causality? Not determinism, not a mechanical causality. What Einstein and Planck are saying is, no, we need an actual universal principle that gives us an idea of why and what is going on. So we can have a deeper sense of how to deal with this subnuclear world. But everybody said, no, this is the end of science. You know, think about in Europe, when the wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed. And this was the end of history. Remember, there were books, I don't know if it was popular here, Francis Fukuyama. It's the end of history. Liberal capitalism has won. Free market has won. It's over. Nothing else is going to happen. You're all going to be bored to death. Okay? But what happened? Exactly what Lynn and Helga said. The Western's capitalist system is in for a bigger crisis than the Soviets were. And in some ways, more dangerous. Think about it. As bad as the Soviet Empire was, as bad as East Germany was, they chose not to massacre their population. They chose not to go to nuclear war to defend themselves. I wouldn't trust some of the people in the West to have the same inhibitions. Tony Blair, the Queen, I wouldn't trust them to do as well as they did in giving up their power. That's an irony. That's the reality of the situation. Now, I'll give you an idea. And so what Lynn's whole point, in a certain sense, starting from his economic outlook, was that human economy is a constant process of development of the scientific and creative powers of human society. And this requires a perpetual cultural development. Focus on creativity. Focus on creative development. And one of the biggest enemies of this is, of course, the Green Movement, besides the monarchy itself. And this can be vicious stuff. I mean, I don't think people really understand how vicious it is. No development, no nuclear power. Which means what? People say, well, we can live here in Denmark or Germany. Well, you probably can't, but what about Africa? Are we going to have enough power to supply Africa, to supply Asia? Is it any wonder that the Chinese are looking for other ways to go on this? What have we had? We've had nothing but cheap labor. That's the free market. The free market is a system of colonial cheap labor. That's all it is. It may not be formal colonies, but by the nature of the free market system itself, by the nature of the monetarist system, floating exchange rates and so on and so forth. Think about it. I had this example. Because people always say, "What about my money?" Everybody says that. What about here? You have Wall Street ripping off people to the tune of trillions. The gap between the rich and the poor in the United States is ridiculous. It's not even a gap anymore. I don't know what you would call it. It's the Grand Canyon. It's something. Okay, it's the asteroid belt. It's huge. Okay, these guys, and they're making more money, blah, blah, blah. And it's only money. But to the degree that people think the money commands the population and what they do, which is what happens. You can bleed the population. Now, but you find out there's no money for anything else. How much money do we need in Detroit? Detroit, as we mentioned, this is a city, I won't go into the details now. They owe $18 billion. That may sound like a lot of money. That's less than the value of the buildings that have been shut down by the banks in Michigan. That's less than the tax value. I'll give you another example, because there's never money. For education, they need $50 million in Philadelphia to keep the schools open. $50 million, it's nothing. It reminds me of a famous senator in the United States back in the 60s from Illinois who said, you know, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, sooner or later you're talking about real money. Okay. Now you can't even say that. It's $1 trillion here and $1 trillion there. So when we were at the Princeton physics lab, where they've been doing work on fusion, it's called the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab. And so we met a guy, a scientist, and most of these guys were excited about what they were doing. And they would get enthusiastic when they started to brief you on things. But then they would be depressed when they told you about the money. Anyway, so this guy was working, the main project is the tokamak, which is the main approach, which is also the big international approach that they have in France. I don't know if the Danes are involved in this, but France, Japan, Spain, okay, the ITER project. Anyway, this guy who's, and there's billions of this, and this guy starts to show us something called the Stellarator, which is a different design for the fusion reactor. It actually tries to use the shape of the plasma itself to contain itself. Whereas in the tokamak, it's pretty much brute force, some other things involved in it. So the guy's showing us very excitedly, well, we have this, we were going to build that, we have this idea, this progress. And so we said to him, well, what happened to the project? Because he said, we don't have this project anymore. Well, the project was shut down. Why was the project shut down? Budget cuts. How much was the budget cut? $159 million. Now, okay, that'd be a lot of money if you had it in your pocket. But $159 million out of trillions that have gone to bail out the banks, trillions in the budget, trillions that are spent on pure speculation, but there isn't $159 million for a fusion project that shows some promise. Just like we've shut down the space program. We shut it down. The United States, which was on the moon 44 years ago. Now that's pretty interesting to think about. You say, well, there's, you know, what do you mean there's been no progress? We have computers. We were on the moon 44 years ago, and we can't go back. China's going to be ahead of us. Everybody's going to be ahead of us. You guys could get ahead of us, because we're not doing anything. There's nothing. So this gives you an idea of money. If there's trillions for the bank, but there's not 50 million for schools, it tells you there's something funny about the money. The money isn't real. It represents nothing in the economy. It represents a means of exchanging what seems to be the financial power that controls the economy. But it has no other reality. It's a complete fiction. And of course, it's become more and more of a fiction. So that, you know, one way or another, whatever you have is very likely to disappear. It might disappear through hyperinflation, as the Germans found out in the 1920s. It might disappear because they bail you in. Let's say they might guarantee some part of it, and they take the rest. The system is dead. And now you see how it intersects the actual sense of creativity, the actual sense of development. And I'll give you an interesting two interesting points that I'll conclude with.
It's sure to read slowly.
Yeah. Because I also want to come back to the sense of immortality. Now, Lynn talks about this, but he has an interesting thing to say about it. Well, any true great discovery of principle is distinguished by the fact that it never continues as a fixed object, but rather exists as a seminal element of the actual in progress motion of a future of mankind. A future proceeding from relatively lower origins of achievements to those masterpieces which, like seeds, have been transformed into a fruit of immortality in the outcome of the present as also the future. Such persons as those are the true immortals. Their characteristic feature is that advance in a society which moves from a relatively modest past to bring about a relatively awesome future state of reality. Okay, we come thus like seeds and so forth. Such are the goals of true immortality, that of the once-born human soul, as written in that heritage which is presented in 1 Corinthians 13. The important thing to be said or written on that account is, as written by that great prophet Paul, to know and to be known, born of such a realization as to become within the great bounds of the realized intention of both the presently living and their inheritance, and so on. So he's repeating this point. But then he says something I find a little humorous. However, be careful. Fantasies as such are plentiful, ephemeral, and never sufficient. The truth must be experienced in the likeness of the life which is still being lived for the sake of the future. Otherwise, the wished-for happiness, with a prospect for the future, will not be sufficient to secure the indispensable outcome. And I think what he's getting at is, people can start to think about their immortality, the future, I'm contributing seeds to the future, and they don't realize it's never going to get there if you don't make that part of the fight now. If that sense of the future, of living in the future, makes you do certain things now. Now, I also want to give you, just so you don't, a little sense of one of the examples of a guy who was, look, let me make a point. People like Planck and Einstein and some others were mocked because they didn't accept the folly of this quantum mechanical theory, this idea of a purely probabilistic world, of a world where the human mind really has no capability of grasping the underlying principles. That's pure observation. But in terms of sense perception, that is what Heisenberg and Bohr say. All there is observation. So therefore, you can't say anything exists between observations. In fact, one of the great dilemmas of quantum theory is, where did the universe come from? There was no observer. Who observed the creation of the universe? God? Who knows? It's not in quantum theory. So it sort of breaks down right at the beginning, but that's another story. At any rate, we have, this is an interview with Max Planck. Brief interview in I think it was 1930. Yeah, 1931. So there's a few, there's one point. My incentive in studying science has been an inner drive after knowledge. But to bring me any satisfaction, this knowledge must be free from obscurity and confusion. I want knowledge that is, as far as possible, exact. That knowledge can be obtained, it seems to me, better through science than through anything else. And then he's asked, has not the aesthetic aspect of science also been an incentive? Have you not felt attracted by the beauty of the scientific picture of the world? Planck. Certainly. The beauty of science is one of the rewards of scientific study. Truth and beauty in science lie very close together, but they are not the same thing, yet they always accompany one another. Would you say one aspect is more important? Planck. How can one decide the relative importance? It's like asking me which is more important, the lock or the key. Would you say that science and arts are akin? There is certainly a kinship between science and art, but at the same time the differences are marked. Science is the result of the desire for knowledge. The beauty of science arises from the fact that there exists a close connection between truth and beauty. This connection is probably due to the very structure of our minds. But the primary aim of the scientific man is not beauty, but knowledge. In this he differs from the artist, whose primary concern is beauty. In his search for beauty, the artist can also reveal to us truth and knowledge. Thus, science and art are akin, and yet they are also different. What do you think the importance of science is to mankind? I put first the part it has played in making men more intelligent. The effort to create science has led men to adopt a certain method of thought. There are a priori various ways in which the mind can function. It can build up various fantasies. It can adopt various ways of reasoning. Which of all these methods is best is adapted to dealing with reality. The development of intelligence is the development of the art of successful thinking. Science has shown men that, to be successful, a certain way of thinking is necessary. By pursuing this method, one can gain real knowledge. Since science can be created only by correct thinking, the pursuit of science has aided the growth of intelligence. Science is also important to mankind. Then he says, what about progress? Yes, man is progress. Then the question is, and he says, and morally, have human beings progressed morally? Plunk. No, I do not think there's been any moral progress. Then the questioner says, but surely men are less cruel than they used to be. We do not have witch burning right now, for example. Plunk. I agree we could not have witch burning now, but I think that what appears as greater kindliness is merely an expression of what could be called better manners. The moral character of man expresses itself in different ways in different ages. The beliefs that led to witch burning are no longer held. Man does not, nowadays, manifest his impulses in that way. His growth in intelligence has made such things impossible. But this does not mean that he has a kinder heart. Modern man finds outlets for his impulses along different lines. But I can see no improvement in the moral character he displays. I do not believe that man has progressed morally. Now, of course, this is 1931, so you get an idea of his sense of what's going on. Then do you think that life and consciousness are the outcome of the random actions of natural laws? Or do you think they form part of some great scheme? Plunk. I believe that life is part of some greater life that we cannot understand. But this is not a scientific belief. It is a belief that must be justified on quite other than scientific grounds. Your question can only be answered by a fantasy. This is where I think, this is where Planck has an impulse. But again, he doesn't have a completely political sense. Then the guy says, a fantasy. Planck. A fantasy is a way of representing things to oneself in other than scientific terms. The beliefs that are expressed in the fantasy are not amenable to scientific tests. They are beliefs of a different order from beliefs that rest on scientific evidence. Your question is not one that can be decided by bringing forward scientific evidence. Nevertheless, it is a question concerning which beliefs may be held. So how are such beliefs justified? Planck. By their influence on character. Such beliefs cannot be sincerely held without profoundly influencing character. A man's character can be the outcome of such beliefs, and the resulting character is the justification or condemnation of the beliefs. This is the only way in which such beliefs can be judged. The scientific criteria of true and false cannot be applied to them. Moral and scientific beliefs are justified on quite different grounds. Question: do you think that consciousness can be explained in terms of matter and its laws? Planck. No. I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. So he went on in this vein. He's asked about modern physics. Planck considers these difficulties to illustrate the extent to which the world of science depends upon the mind. All right. Planck just says that science depends on the mind, our view of nature. Thus we assume everything that exists in nature exists in space and time. The material universe, we assume, is something that exists in space and time. When we regard certain modern scientific entities, like the light quantum, from this point of view, they seem to possess contradictory properties. Thus, certain experiments show that light quantum is very large, others show it is very small. Planck suggests that the light quantum is something to which the notions of spatial and temporal extension do not apply. Men must learn to regard space and time, not as objective realities to which everything must conform, but as concepts which, in this region of phenomena, must now be transcended. They are not objective realities, independent of consciousness, and perhaps none such exists. And he doesn't believe in a deterministic system. Okay. He regards the principle of indeterminacy.
It's too fast.
He regards the principle of indeterminacy as a temporary device, and not as a discovery concerning the ultimate character of the universe. And in this, he's generally along the lines of all the opponents of this quantum idea. Not the quantum itself. No one denies